I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar, Understanding and Supporting the Emotional Health of Black Children. Our host, Dr. Orson Morrison of DePaul University, will review the data and best practices on supporting Black children. The event will end with a brief guided meditation practice that encourages personal and collective reflection and action. This program is made possible by funding through the Oak Park Township Community Mental Health Board and in partnership with the Oak Park Elementary School District 97 and the Kennedy Forum, Illinois. This program is also offered in celebration of the 10th anniversary of DePaul University's College of Science and Health, and another thanks to Healing Illinois and the Chicago Community Trust for their support. And finally, and most importantly, thanks to all of you for joining us. You can follow all these groups on Facebook at the Community Mental Health Board, OPT, Oak Park 97, DePaul Family and Community Services, and Kennedy Forum, Illinois. I will put those in the chat here so everybody can see those. And then finally, I kind of want to tee up Dr. Morrison here. I often call him Orson, so apologies by that. But Dr. Morrison is a member of the Kennedy Forum, Illinois Leadership Council. He is a licensed clinical psychologist and the director of the DePaul University Family and Community Services. He provides clinic oversight, staff training, clinical supervision, and is involved in program development and the evaluation of clinical services at the Family and Community Services. Dr. Morrison's professional interests and areas of expertise include psychotherapy with children, adolescents and families, psychological assessment, contemplative practices, culture and identity, and working within a social justice empowerment framework. And on a more personal note, Dr. Morrison is a dear friend and colleague, and I am so happy that we could collaborate on this webinar. So please, Dr. Morrison, take it away.
Thank you so much, James, for that warm welcome, and welcome to all of you who have joined the webinar. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to be affiliated with the Kennedy Forum of Illinois, an organization that continues to shine the light on a broad range of mental health and addictions issues, but not only raising awareness, but working also towards addressing policy amendments and making change at that larger macro level. So thank you so much. Before getting started, I'd like to take a moment to make a land and historical acknowledgement. For those of us that are in the Chicago area, we acknowledge that we are on the unceded traditional lands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples. We also acknowledge that the colonialism brought to these lands has had a profound impact on, in particular, Indigenous and African identities and wellness, not only under slavery, but via racist laws and segregation of people in our community. And these acknowledgements are really just a small way that we can commit ourselves to a lifetime of anti-racist work. Today's agenda, I will be covering a variety of different topics related to children's mental health with regards to Black children. I'll first review some of the normal hallmarks of childhood and adolescence. I'll then talk about the data on suicide in Black children and teens. We'll talk about some of the diagnostic and treatment disparities that are seen in the population of Black children. And then we'll transition into talking about ways to affirm and support Black children in their emotional and mental health process. We'll end with a call to action. And as James mentioned, we will close with a very brief mindfulness practice. One of my interests is pairing mindfulness and social justice. And so I think that taking in this data that you're about to see, really thinking about it, and really intentionally reflecting on how you may want to move forward after learning about some of the data that I'm about to share. I will take some time at the end to answer some questions. Let's start by reviewing some of the hallmarks of normal childhood and adolescence. For those of you that work with children, that have children, that work in child development, know that in early childhood, we're really focused on creating a safe, a warm, a responsive environment around a child. And it's through that solid foundation of safety, of love, of trust, that kids learn how to move forward in their development and explore the environment and learn and grow. And there's a lot of research on the importance of these early relationships of warmth and safety as a way that kids develop the ability to co-regulate their emotions, to learn language skills. And there's even some robust research on neuronal development, how our brains develop at an early age in response to that kind of an environment. In middle childhood, kids are navigating, learning what's right, what's wrong, learning how to tolerate their emotions, to delay gratification and impulses, exploring building friendships and exploring the environment around them. Also, gender identity becomes important during middle childhood. And throughout this phase, kids are testing the environment. They're trying things out. Sometimes they're getting it right, and many times they're not. They're making mistakes. And that is a part of the normal developmental process throughout childhood and adolescence, for that matter. It's how kids learn. As adolescents, kids become more focused on identity development, a sense of belongingness. Where do I fit? Who are my people? There's a lot of emotional intensity for those of you that have teenagers or that work with teenagers. One moment there's a certain emotion, and then the next minute there's another emotion. Contradictory behaviors. And kids at this age are really grappling with these questions. Am I normal? Who am I? Who do I want to be? Who do I want to become? And also navigating the reality of, can I become the things that I want to be, right? And so I think for Black children in particular, there's this reconciling between, this is who I want to be, but do I see myself? Are there pathways to getting to that place? Do I see people that are doing the things that I want to do, that I'm passionate about? So there's often this reconciling between these two questions. And I think the reason I show this slide is really for us to be thinking about how we help or hinder Black children in developing through the normative process of becoming a child and becoming an adolescent. Do we tolerate mistakes? Do we show them? Do we teach them? Do we take a nurturing, responsive, warm approach to helping Black children achieve these milestones? Related to these sorts of questions is this question: do you see me as a child? And I think there's some really concerning and interesting research that has shown that, adults around Black children may not actually perceive them to be who they are. And so, for instance, this study here, The Essence of Innocence, by the age of 10, Black girls and boys are viewed as less innocent than their white peers. And by the age of 10, Black children are viewed as, on average, 4.53 years older than they actually are. So when you think about the normal developmental milestones of childhood and what it takes from adults and from the environments around children to help usher kids through these developmental tasks, yet we're not seeing necessarily Black children as children, it really raises the question, are our environments really, really responsive to their needs? I'm going to move now into reviewing some of the data on suicide with regards to Black children and youth. I do want to note here, particularly for those of you that maybe have experienced a suicide in your family, or who are struggling with mental health issues of your own, to really take care of yourself during the presentation. I'm going to be sharing some data that is concerning. And so I just wanted to make you aware of that. Do what you need to do to take care of yourself. We're going to start by watching a very brief news clip.
Back now with the crisis in our country, a staggering rise in suicide attempts by Black children. NBC's Rahema Ellis now with one mother's heartbreaking message. And we want to note, if you do have youngsters in the room, some of what's discussed is troubling to hear.
Little dude, so happy. From birth, 7 was his parents' joy. The child doctor said Tammy Charles couldn't have.
You're a miracle baby, huh? Absolutely. I told him over and over, Daddy and I love you so much. And this is something that we always did.
But last year, at 10 years old, they lost him to suicide in their home in Louisville, Kentucky.
We teach our children about stranger danger or guns or any other type of outward hurt that we try to protect them from. This is one that I was blindsided by. My 10-and-a-half-year-old son, my miracle child, my only child, was dead.
A study commissioned by the Congressional Black Caucus shows in recent years, self-reported suicide attempts by Black teens increased by 73%. The rate decreased for white teens. Black children younger than 13 were twice as likely to die by suicide than white children.
Really shocking.
NYU professor Michael Lindsay led the study.
Why is this happening?
I think we have to talk about the racism and discrimination that is prevailing in our society. That trauma, I think, is engendering a sense of hopelessness for kids, wondering if their life really matters.
Tammy advocated for her son, trying to get him help, and worked with his school after she says he was bullied, called the N-word, and choked on the school bus just months before his death.
I miss most his smile. I miss calling his name, and I miss hearing someone call me mommy. That is what I miss the most.
Nationwide, Black and brown children are less likely than non-Latino white children to receive mental health services. Philadelphia psychotherapist Salima McNeil is trying to change that, raising money for free counseling for families of color.
We really want young folks to know that they aren't alone. Now more than ever, our folks are actually open to the healing and willing to get the healing.
Healing for Tammy is sharing her son's story.
If you don't have children, or if you do, tell them you are loved, you are important, and if there's anything that I can do to help you through, please tell me, talk to me, please.
Hoping other parents never experience her pain. Rahema Ellis, NBC News, New York.
Back now with the crisis.
It's a really, really heartbreaking story there. And one of the goals for me tonight was really to raise greater awareness about what is happening regarding suicide rates in Black children and teens. And so the next few slides, I'm going to dig a little deeper into some of that data. From 2001 to 2017 for teens, so these are kids who are above the age of 13, suicide rates for Black male teens have increased by 60%. And for Black female teens have increased by 182%. Really, really staggering statistics from the CDC. When we look at children under the age of 13, between 5 and 12, we see similar trends. We see increasing rates, and we see that Black children in this age group are twice as likely to die from suicide than similarly aged white children. Unfortunately, with this data, this epidemiological data, we do not yet know exactly why this is occurring. But many clinicians and researchers and politicians are starting to really raise the alarm and call for much more needed research into trying to understand the nuances in terms of what is going on here. In the news clip, Dr. Lindsay alluded to racism, discrimination, systemic oppression as a factor, which I do agree is something that we really do need to consider. In terms of suicide methods, with regards to Black children, we've seen an significant increase in the rate of suicide by hanging and suffocation. So this is the primary method by which Black children who do suicide. And I cannot help but think about concepts such as multi-generational trauma and historical trauma, particularly in relation to African-American populations. The legacy of slavery and brutal practices such as lynching, to sort of have that as a historical backdrop and to see statistics like this really, really pain me to see. So let's look at some of the risk factors for suicide, and then also some of the protective factors, the resilience factors that one needs to consider. So in terms of risk factors for suicide, there's a term called John Henryism. And this means that when people face prolonged adversity, chronic stress, chronic trauma, community violence, racial oppression, often that requires a high effort coping in order to survive, in order to thrive. And it's that high effort coping that really takes a toll over the long run. And there's more and more research coming out about the impact that truly has on physical health and emotional health. We talk about stigma in the mental health field, but oftentimes there's a double stigma. So not only are Black children and families maybe have a stigma around the concept of mental health, but maybe there's some stigma, some shame around that double identity of being in a marginalized, racialized group. For some Black families, there may be this idea of let's keep our problems in the family. And so mental health treatment may not be the first line intervention that Black families elect. They may try to handle things on its own. And that's really, really important to consider in terms of our relationships with families, right? Particularly in school settings, particularly in other sorts of healthcare settings. The more and more we engage family members and parents and build trusting relationships, the more likely it is for family members to maybe actually disclose that they need help. There is some research on social media, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later in the presentation, particularly around adolescence. And this has to do with exposure to race-related traumatic events on our social media feeds. We do know that social media is on a constant scroll. We're constantly getting bombarded with messages, with posts. And so with regards to traumatic, racially motivated posts, this can have a profound effect on teens. Some of the research on younger children, so that age group 5 to 12, suggests that when there is family conflict, that seems to sometimes precipitate a suicide attempt or a suicide act. And again, for younger children, those children that are struggling with impulse control issues or emotional dysregulation issues seem to be more vulnerable for suicide attempts and completion. And then of course, a family history of suicide is also a risk factor. With regards to the protective factors in protecting kids from suicide, a cohesive family, so children reporting that they have close relationships with their parents, their family members. Religion, spirituality seems to be a factor, but not just belonging to a church or to a faith community. It's this sense, this intrinsic sense, this inner sense of having a relationship with a higher power and viewing that higher power as a source of comfort and as a source of problem solving. Lots and lots of data coming out about school climate, positive school climate. So when Black children report that they feel connected, that they feel happy, they feel supported in the school environment, they're less likely to attempt or commit suicide. A connected and supportive peer network, so that sense of belongingness, having a supportive peer group. Self-esteem, the higher your self-esteem as a Black child, the less likely you are to attempt suicide. And self-esteem, thinking about self-esteem broadly and inclusive of one's racial identity. So having a sense of pride around one's racial or cultural background as well is very important. And then there's some data on academic achievement. So when kids and Black children feel like they are succeeding academically, that seems to be a protective factor as well. Shifting now to talking a little bit about the diagnostic disparities we see when we look at Black children compared to other racial groups. Trauma and adverse childhood experiences, Black youth are overrepresented in exposure to trauma and adverse childhood experiences, including things like racial oppression and poverty and these sorts of traumatic chronic stressors. We also see that Black children have higher rates of general anxiety, social anxiety, and express fear towards particularly authority figures, such as police officers. With regards to depression, this is interesting. We often see an underdiagnosis of depression with regards to Black children and an underscreening for Black children when we compare to other racial groups. We also know that Black children may actually manifest the symptoms of depression slightly differently. And in some studies, we see that Black children may not even demonstrate many of the common symptoms of depression. And so we really do need to look and do more research on, how do Black children manifest these symptoms? Are we missing something? Can we ask different questions during our screenings or diagnostic interviews? There's been some interesting research on children with neurodevelopmental disorders, such as autism spectrum disorders. For those of you that work in an early childhood environment or work with young kids or have young kids with autism spectrum disorders, you know how important it is to get that early screening, that early assessment, that early diagnosis, and that early intervention. Kids that receive that early intervention at an early age tend to have better long-term outcomes. But we see racial disparities when we look at the data on Black children, that they are actually getting this type of diagnosis much later than peers from other racial groups. And in fact, later, up to 3 years after a parent raises the concern with a professional, it takes that long often to get that sort of diagnosis. So it really does place Black children with autism spectrum disorders at risk. Regarding ADHD, we see that Black children are often underdiagnosed with ADHD compared to other kids in other racial groups. And for those of you that work in school environments or have a child with ADHD, you know that kind of a diagnosis often qualifies you for academic supports through a formal plan like a 504 plan or other accommodations plan. And we also know that Black children tend to be overrepresented on the special ed side, right? So they're maybe not getting the appropriate diagnoses and not getting the appropriate supports in a mainstream educational environment, but instead they're being referred to special ed. So I thought that was very, very interesting data and concerning. We often see misdiagnosis when we think about Black children. One of the examples here is on the diagnosis of conduct disorder and disruptive behavior disorders. Black children are overrepresented when we look at those sorts of diagnoses. And what's happening here is that we're placing greater emphasis on aggressiveness or externalizing behavior. And we're missing, our biases is that Black children are not struggling with depression or more internalizing conditions. And we see that this ends up in a sort of a criminalization of mental health symptoms in Black children. And it's evident by the staggering rates of overrepresentation of our Black children in the juvenile justice system. I would be remiss if I didn't make some comment about the impact of COVID-19. We don't really have a lot of data specifically on Black children related to COVID-19 and mental health, but we do have data, and we know this from our personal and professional lives, that Black and Brown families are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. Job loss, financial stress, loss and grief, medical issues related to COVID diagnoses. And so we know that pre-pandemic, Black children were struggling emotionally, and we can only imagine that the current pandemic has even intensified those particular emotional struggles for children and families. With regards to intersectionality, and intersectionality is a concept whereby each of us has multiple identities, right? We have our racial and ethnic identity, we have our gender identity, our sexual orientation, our socioeconomic status, and all of those identities come together and converge in this intersectional way. And the resulting intersectionality has its associated disadvantages and privileges, and sometimes there's a cumulative effect when we look at different identities coming together. And what we know from the research is that Black children who have other identities like an LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender questioning identity, those that are living in poverty, those that are housing unstable, and other sorts of identities make them more vulnerable for emotional and mental health crises. In terms of the data on mental health service utilization and access, overall in the world of pediatric mental health, we have a shortage. We have a shortage of people that are adequately trained and specialized in working with child mental health issues. And so even if you're well-resourced, you can sometimes really, really struggle to find a qualified pediatric mental health specialist. Adding in the layers of culture and race and socioeconomics and different insurance coverage or lack of insurance coverage, you can imagine that creates additional challenges and barriers to accessing quality child-focused service. We do know that Black families are less likely to initiate and more likely to underutilize mental health services compared to other racial groups. We also know from the data that schools are very, very important access points when we talk about Black children accessing mental health treatment. And so when we think about program development and policy, we really do need to think about bolstering school-based mental health services, as well as school community partnerships that really create seamless models for helping families access the sorts of services they need. We also know that other models like primary care, behavioral health integration models are also very, very helpful in helping vulnerable families access the care they need. With regards to, when kids and families, Black children actually get the services that they need, most of the data that we have suggests that they do well. They respond to treatment and often improve outcomes. So So we really need to work on the barriers in terms of access. Turning now to thinking about how do we affirm, how do we support Black children? We have heard throughout the presentation this focus on racism and chronic stressors like systemic racism and discrimination. We need to get better at talking about race and racism with our children. We need to help them not only develop a really healthy, positive identity around their own cultural and racial identities, but we also need to prepare them for the realities of living and navigating and developing and learning in a system that still has a lot of these systemic barriers in place. And oftentimes as adults, that really starts with ourselves, so acknowledging and reflecting on our own values, our own beliefs, our own biases, experiences, privileges, disadvantages, experiences, and looking at how that has shaped you, and getting comfortable with that, getting okay with that so that you can broach these sorts of conversations with kids. And we do know from the research that kids learn about racial differences and can understand racial differences from a very, very young age. As young as 6 months, they start to recognize racial differences. And so we need to start having these conversations early. We need to continue to educate ourselves around Black history, the legacy of anti-Black racism and white supremacy, and of course, just teaching our children how to recognize racism and how to navigate that in their lives. We also need to view Black children as children, and we need to help them navigate the range of emotions that they feel, whether it be sadness or anger or irritability. We need to create safe, responsive relationships with them where they feel supported, where they feel listened to. And we can use those relationships to, again, do all of this work around mitigating the risk and preparing for how to deal with racism as it comes in, and periodically checking in with them about the range of emotional issues that they're experiencing in this current day. One of the protective factors I mentioned when I was talking about suicide was academic success, so academic achievement. And we do know that, certainly here in the United States and in other places in the world, we still see a profound achievement gap, right? And we need to continue to work at that. And that involves a variety of things. It involves looking at our curriculums and making sure that they're culturally relevant, that kids, Black children, can see themselves in the content. They can actually see their stories in what they're reading and what they're learning about. And they can actually deepen their own self-esteem and pride around their cultural and racial backgrounds. Belongingness in the academic environment is very, very important. So continuing to create programs and structures, restorative justice is a big intervention system now that schools are kind of adopting. This pro-social conflict resolution strategies, anti-bullying campaigns at schools are really getting big. Positive teacher-student relationships. There's some research suggesting that low-achieving Black children are the group of children that is most likely to respond to that positive, warm relationship with a teacher. Yet we see over and over again, low-achieving Black children are placed in classrooms that seem to have the lowest warmth and the highest conflict environment. So we're not doing these kids a service by any means. We really need to bolster the warmth and the quality of relationships that teachers have with particularly vulnerable children. School-based teachers support racial and ethnic socialization. I commented on that earlier. Here's that study on social media. So this is some relatively new research, 2019, that has suggested that kids, teenagers in particular, who are exposed to race-related traumatic events on social media have increased symptoms of depression and PTSD symptoms. And so we need to be educating our children about the dangers of that, and also perhaps limiting their access to social media. And certainly as adults, really being mindful of what we're posting online, right? So we see over and over situations that involve traumatic events that are race-related, but maybe instead of posting that viral video of the actual shooting or the actual event that is traumatic, maybe using social media in a different way to raise awareness that something happened, maybe by sharing a news article or by sharing other action items or action strategies that one can take in order to better advocate on the policy level or make change in your community or organize a rally or something like that. I think there's different ways we can use social media to continue to highlight these important issues without perpetuating trauma symptoms. I really liked reading about this, the work by Alfred Wade Boykin, who talks about looking at the cultural characteristics of Black children through this strengths-based lens. And I think this is something else that we really, as adults and systems around Black children, need to reorient. We cannot continue to look at the characteristics, the behaviors, the values of Black children as deficits, as problematic, as annoyances. We need to really reframe the way that we look at Black children. We need to take a strengths-based approach. We need to look at values and ancestral gifts and cultural gifts that have been present for many, many generations and across many, many African cultures. Verve, affective expression, the oral tradition of many African cultures as a way that kids may prefer to learn or explore different academic subject areas, spirituality, harmony, movement, moving our bodies, social time perspective. This is an idea where in Afrocentric cultures that time is meant to be social and meant to be enjoyed, right? And this communalism, this belongingness, very, very important in various African cultures. So really thinking about how our environments make it possible for Black children to express their full range of gifts and values and ways of looking at the world. So it truly does take a village to address these issues. We need to continue to recognize, to center the Black community, Black voices, particularly youth voices, in helping to shape our response to some of this data and to create healing environments. We need to look at Black and African culture itself as sources of healing and wellness and integrate that into what we're doing in our psychotherapy, in our classroom curriculums, in our other healthcare systems. We need to center the family as well, so making sure that we're not just working one-on-one with a child, we're also trying to involve the parents, the grandparents, other members of the community that might be important to that family. And we all need to continue to evolve, to dismantle, to create systems and partnerships that truly, truly address the program level, the policy level, to really, really dismantle racism and race bias in order to really truly address the mental health outcomes for Black children. So urgently, we need to continue to push for exploring the epidemiology of Black child suicides. We need to understand the impact of race-based trauma, discrimination, white supremacy on the mental health of Black children and other racialized children for that matter. We need to make sure that kids are adequately screened, and there's some movement, and different states and different localities are adopting more universal screening approaches so that all kids get screened for depression and mental health conditions. But we need to look at the ways in which we're screening to make sure that we're tapping into some of those other concepts, like, are we asking about experiences with race-based trauma and discrimination as well? Address barriers to treatment access, school-based mental health, primary care, behavioral integration as models. We need to strengthen treatment relevance and pathways to workforce diversification. We need more child-focused mental health professionals of diverse racial backgrounds. Research on non-white children is still not as deep and nuanced as research on white children. So we need to continue to get funding and to really develop a research agenda around these sorts of topics. And we need to continue to ask questions on resilience and protective factors. What keeps Black children healthy and safe? And so as we wind down here, I know I've shared a lot of data with you, and a lot of the data is actually quite concerning. And so I know even when I was developing this talk, I was I was feeling a bit melancholic by reviewing all of these important research papers. And in line with the grant that I have through the Oak Park Township, we're doing work around mindfulness and mindfulness in schools. And I do find that mindfulness and social justice really go hand in hand, right? We need to really pause. We need to really reflect on what you just heard. What's coming up for you in your thoughts? What's coming up for you in your emotions? How is this feeling in your body? And what do you want to do about it? So just taking a pause to really reflect on it. So for the next 5 minutes, I really just invite you to get comfortable and to just listen to this brief guided meditation, and then we'll open it up for some questions.
Taking a moment to settle in, either laying on your back or sitting in a chair, and allowing the surface you're laying on or sitting on to take on the work of holding you up. Closing the eyes or taking a soft downward gaze a few feet in front of you. Take a few intentional deep breaths in and out. And begin to notice what is here in this moment for you and your thoughts, your emotions, and in your body. Being open to whatever arises without judgment or with curiosity. In this brief practice, we will be using a framework called loving kindness meditation. It is a practice of tapping into our heart-centered compassion towards ourselves and others. And the best you can, bringing attention to the energy in your heart. It may be helpful to gently place a hand over your heart, opening your capacity to feel tenderness towards and reminding yourself of your innate goodness and capacity to love and to create change. And from this place of openness, imagining in your hearts and minds a Black child or Black children, known or unknown to you. And from this place of warmth and embodied love, repeating silently to yourself. May Black children be loved. May Black children feel loved. May Black children be safe. May Black children feel safe. May Black children be cherished. May Black children feel cherished. May Black children thrive. May Black children be seen for who they are. May Black children breathe freely and easily. May Black children be nourished by their communities. May the caregiving systems around Black children be strong and nurturing. May Black children be supported in bringing their gifts and talents into the world. As this brief practice comes to a close, holding on to a sense of love, as well as an awareness of the realities of systemic racism and injustice. And taking a moment to reflect on this question. What must be done to ensure that all Black children are valued and loved? And in a moment when you hear the bell, gradually bringing your attention back, opening your eyes, but holding on to that sense of compassion, connectedness, or any intentions or desired actions that may be present for you.
All right, well, thank you so much for participating with me. I'm also sharing some resources here from the National Institute of Mental Health and some other resources. I do have some resources also from the Kennedy Forum of Illinois, and we've created some toolkits here for facilitating conversations in your community and just keeping the conversations going. The more that we talk about these issues, the more that we raise awareness, the more likely we are to create change in our sphere of influence. So I hope that all of you have enjoyed the talk and happy to take some questions. It looks like we have a few minutes. All right, so I'm just going to read some of the questions out loud and do my best to answer them. So I am of the opinion that due to the nature of their physical environment, PTSD impact many children of African extraction. However, this is rarely diagnosed, as is depression in children of African extraction. Oftentimes, they are diagnosed with behavioral issues and the like and treated as such. Your thoughts about this, please, Dr. Morrison? How can this be addressed? So that is exactly what I had actually shared in the talk, and the research supports that, that we are often over-diagnosing, externalizing symptoms, and ignoring or not seeing the underlying internal conditions like anxiety and depression and trauma as well. So we need to get better at, I think universal screening is a great option, but using screening tools that actually capture the full range of adverse childhood experiences, including racism and discrimination. Let's see. All right, I just see some comments there, but not any more questions. Oh, okay, I got a question here. My son joined me this evening and he has a question. He wants to know how he can combat feelings of being alone when he is the only Black boy in his class. He wants to know how he can better make friends. Well, it's a great, great question, and thank you for involving your son in the talk. I think this is part of the solution, is really to make sure that we are creating conversations that involve youth, so that we destigmatize mental health and emotional concerns, and create an environment where kids can talk about what's bothering them. I think that looking at the sorts of supports that the school has as well, like perhaps there's some extracurricular groups or clubs that he may consider joining, or if not, maybe he wants to create one that doesn't exist, right? And so really, really encouraging him to take leadership in that area, and to maybe identify a particular adult as well in the school building that he feels comfortable with, and might take him under their wing and mentor him in trying to create some relationships in the school environment. So that's sort of what comes to mind at this time. But it is a reality that many of us who work or who learn in spaces that are mostly white, that can be quite stressful. And so to acknowledge that, and to find ways of taking care of yourself, both inside of school and outside of school, right? Yeah, one of the questions here was, one of the slides showed that 5-year-old Black children are committing suicide. Yes, it doesn't happen very often, but yes, it does happen. And as I showed in the slide, the primary method is by hanging and suffocation. Yeah, why do you think it takes an average of up to 3 years to get a diagnosis for autism or depression? Right, the study that I referenced was specific about autism spectrum disorders. I think there's a lot of factors there at play. It could be that there's some bias, there's some racial bias there, that the professionals that are being brought this concern by the parents maybe are not taking it seriously. Maybe they're not seeing it as clearly as they would with a child of another racial background. Perhaps there are other barriers, insurance, finance, there are other things that might be getting in the way as well. What can schools and teachers do to help facilitate the student? I think that may mean, relationships, how to facilitate relationships with a student. I think that school staff need to learn, can learn evidence-based practices on how to form relationships with kids. I think, oftentimes teachers are not taught how to create relationships and relationships with diverse kids. And so I know at DePaul Family and Community Services, we're doing a model called CARE, Child-Adult Relationship Enhancement. And we go into schools and we teach school staff, teachers, how to actually create relationships using very, very specific skills. And we coach them in the classroom as well. Yeah, there's some questions here. There's a question about a child presenting with ADHD, history of trauma. In those sorts of situations where there's like a complex diagnostic picture, this is why we need more specialized child-focused mental health professionals who can do that assessment in a thorough manner, in a comprehensive manner, that is able to tease apart all of the different things that are going on for a child. So if the school is able to provide that, I would advocate for that. If you have the ability to and resources to secure an outside professional to work with, I might recommend that as well. We are at about just after 7, and I know there's several other questions here coming in. I don't know if there's a way for me to get these questions and I can respond, or people can I have my contact information here on the next slide. If people really do have any burning questions that they want to ask, they are more than welcome to email me, and I'll do my best to answer them as well. Okay. I'm also putting up the link to the brief evaluation for tonight's event. We'll also email that out to you. All the registrants will email that to you to get your feedback. But it's been my pleasure to speak with you tonight. I hope that you found it informative.
Hey, Dr. Morrison, thank you so much. Really, some incredible information and insights. Just want to say thank you. I think on behalf of everybody who's joined us, and we'll be sure to, as Dr. Morrison mentioned, we will send out I put the link in the chat here, but we'll send out the link for feedback related to tonight's session in an email, along with a copy or a link to the video of this session. And we'll make sure to grab a bunch of those questions from folks too, and find a way, whether it's through me to Dr. Morrison or you directly to Dr. Morrison, to make sure that if you have something that you're looking for a little bit of advice on or some insight, that we can get to that. So thank you so much to everybody for joining us. Please go and enjoy the rest of your evening and have a great rest of the week. And fingers crossed for warmer weather wherever you are, whether it's Chicago or somewhere else. Spring is near, and really looking forward to turning this corner that we're all facing right now. So thank you again, Dr. Morrison. Really appreciate you and all the work that you've done. And thanks to everybody who joined us this evening.
Have a good night, everybody.